Hey everybody, Mike Naso here with the latest on the tropics. Today is November 30th, which means it is the end of the official calendar year of the 2023 Atlantic hurricane season, which runs from June 1st until November 30th every year. You could always have storms outside of that, and we did in 2023. We had an unnamed subtropical storm in January of 2023 which gave us 20 named storms total. So it was kind of a posthumous upgrade to a named storm. We had a very unusual year, and I'm going to talk about some of the highlights of the hurricane season. We had 20 named storms, 19 of them got names because the January storm was unnamed. So we got all the way from Arlene to Tammy, and that is quite far down the name list. Of those 20 storms, only 7 became hurricanes, and only 3 became major hurricanes. Now, the reason for this was because we did have an El Nino, which normally suppresses Atlantic hurricanes, but we had such record warm sea surface temperatures that normally gives us more Atlantic hurricanes that it was kind of a mixed bag. So I think of this hurricane season like imagine that you bought 20 lottery tickets, but only 7 were winners and only 3 were anything over $10. That's pretty much the way I look at this hurricane season. It was definitely a quantity over quality year, but that was good news for land masses. Not everybody, though. Here's the tracks of the hurricanes. Now, remember, this is preliminary. They're going to be tweaked, and some of the intensities may be raised up, raised down. But obviously, most of the activity was out in the Atlantic basin here off Africa to the east of the Leeward Islands and mostly to the east of Bermuda. Really, a lot of the activity stayed away from the Caribbean, with the exception of our early storm Brett down here, which was weak, and then Franklin, which became one of the strongest hurricanes of the year out in the Atlantic, but remained a tropical storm when it struck the Dominican Republic. And then Idalia's formation in the Western Caribbean. The Caribbean, you guys really didn't get too much in areas there of Jamaica, the Cayman Islands, and most of Cuba not being impacted. Although the islands here at the end, Barbuda, you got struck back to back by Tropical Storm Philippe and Hurricane Tammy later in the season. So that was a little bit of a scare with some of the storms getting close, but most of the activity was out at sea. In fact, almost every system turned to the right. If you notice, Franklin turned right and then turned right again. Our storms all turned out to sea out here. Idalia hooked to the right into the Florida Big Bend. The only storm that really defied the odds was Harold. Remember Tropical Storm Harold hit Texas? Harold would have been a hurricane if it had had a little more time. And that was a late August tropical storm. Had it developed earlier, it would have definitely been a hurricane for the South Texas coast. Now, we're going to talk about Hurricane Idalia since that was the main storm of the year for the Atlantic and for the United States. Idalia was the strongest landfalling hurricane on the Florida Big Bend since 1896. And I'll explain why in a minute. It caused $2.5 billion in damage, and it was a nasty little storm, but I think it was a little less than we had all feared. It had a very strange formation. For late August, we do not see tracks come out of the Caribbean and into the areas of western Florida. We see that usually in October. But because it was an El Nino year, we had kind of this sloppiness pull up into the Caribbean, become a tropical cyclone, and then take aim at Florida. It briefly became a Category 4, a minimum Category 4, down at 130 miles an hour. But then it began to weaken as it made landfall because it was very small. It was interacting with some wind shear, a little drier air, cooler waters up here in the Northeast Gulf, even though waters were very warm, not as warm as they had been. And Idalia caused problems, but if you watch the satellite loop, it really started to kind of fall apart there at landfall. You can see that even better on the infrared. Watch here. It didn't look too hot. Most of the convection was displaced to the south. You had the eye up here. It looked sloppy for a major hurricane. Nevertheless, it did come ashore as a major hurricane near Keaton Beach, and it caused problems. A lot of flooding problems. Thankfully, a lot of those houses are built on stilts to try and survive the surge, and the winds blew through pretty quick, but it was a damaging hurricane for that area of the Big Bend, which is not accustomed to many hurricanes because of the shape of the coast. We often get them sliding Tampa south or going off to the North Gulf Coast or the Panhandle, this little area in here, this concave, just doesn't get a lot of landfalls. And it did this year. But it was the strongest that they've seen in, what is that, 127, 128 years? So almost 130 years since they've seen a hurricane that strong in the Big Bend of Florida. Now, as we look at the media's coverage of it, I did want to say it was a strong hurricane, but when you get these headlines, history making, once in a lifetime storm, they're gaslighting the climate change agenda. They're trying to see, you see, it's a history making storm. Well, yeah, it hit sop choppy Florida. They don't get hit very often. Every hurricane's unique. Every year I could find you, this is the first year that we had 2 hurricanes on this day since 25 years ago. Everything's historic. Every hurricane matters. That's why a lot of people like me who like hurricanes like history, because you can never change it. So while this was a nasty hurricane, I don't like the way hurricanes are taken advantage of. And the fact that it hits areas that are not large metropolitan cities and the media instantly forgets about it sometimes shows how they really are. Nevertheless, look at that radar. The eye was clearly degraded at landfall. It had really sucked in some dry air. It started to undergo an eye wall replacement, and those winds weakened quickly from 130 down to about 120 or so at landfall, 120, 125. Don't be surprised if the intensity of Idalia is lowered to about 115 at landfall. Still a Category 3, I think. Now, in the eastern Pacific, I got to talk about Hurricane Otis, because the Pacific had a very busy year, like they normally do in El Nino years, but Hurricane Otis takes the cake. This thing was the strongest landfall on the eastern Pacific side of Mexico that we've ever seen. It was the strongest landfall ever in Mexico on that side. 165 mile per hour Category 5, never before on record. And remember, records for the Pacific, you're talking 50, 60 years ago, and they're not reliable. But as best we could tell in the last half century at least, we have never had a Category 5 hurricane make landfall on that side of Mexico until 2023 with Hurricane Otis. It's clearly the costliest Pacific hurricane we've ever seen at $16 billion damage, and that is because it came ashore near Acapulco. Look at this track here. It was very weak, thought it would be a tropical storm, and it just got in the right environment and exploded. It was tiny, it was compact, it was over warm waters. It took off. It was very rare. Category 5 right into major metropolitan Acapulco. And when you look at that satellite there, within this eye were winds of 165, and I suspect there's a chance it was even a little stronger over water. But nevertheless, it pushed all that wind and energy right into downtown Acapulco, and it was disastrous. Look at here. This is from the areas of emergency management there. We have wind damage that destroyed anything in red and damaged everything in orange. So look at how every area here in the greater metropolitan area of Acapulco received damaged or destroyed situations from this hurricane. It was very, very nasty for Acapulco. And again, the media barely talked about it. So even when it hits a major metropolitan area, sometimes they don't care. It's whatever they're in the mood for. But for the people that got impacted, it was quite a disastrous storm. Now, the strongest storm of the year was Hurricane Lee, and that was a Category 5 at 165 miles per hour. And the strongest landfall in the Atlantic was Idalia at Keaton Beach as a Category 3, and this season gave us the 4th most named storms on record. Hurricane Lee really was a big event for a lot of meteorologists, but it stayed away from most land masses. It did impact Atlantic Canada, it buffeted Bermuda, but when you have a hurricane this big and bad, if it ain't hitting land, it's going to be considered not as bad as they think, or not that severe. The fact that it became a Category 5 out at sea, it was impressive, and it was a very dangerous storm. But like I said, many of those storms this year turned out. They turned out to sea, and Hurricane Lee was no different. So, overall, a very busy Atlantic hurricane season with some nasty impacts. A Category 3 hurricane hitting Florida, a Category 5 hurricane in the eastern Pacific hitting downtown Acapulco, Mexico. 20 named storms, 7 of them were hurricanes, 3 major hurricanes. It's too soon to say what the hurricane season of 2024 may bring. However, at this time in November of 2023, there are some indications it could be an active year, as we could see the El Nino start to dissipate and we could see the active warm Atlantic remain. So, whether or not that occurs, we just don't know yet. We'll have to wait and see. I'm Mike Naso with the latest on the end of hurricane season 2023, and I'll talk to you next time.